hillbilly from Tennessee can study this stuff and figure it out. Maybe you can too. So, Corey and his wife of 25 years, Melody, have 3 sons, Garrett, Gordon, and Gannon. Corey began preaching at the age of 15. He's a preacher at the Martin Church of Christ in Martin, Tennessee. Did I get that right, Martin, Tennessee? And he works with Bear Valley still to a certain degree. Just loves to preach. He loves God. He loves his wife, and that is evident. I'm friends with Corey on Facebook, and that is evident that he loves his wife and he loves his 3 children. So I don't want to take up much of his time, so Mr. Corey, come on up.
Well, good morning. Good to be here with you. I didn't get a cordless mic. Do I need a cordless mic? If I want one? Okay. I forgot to ask about that. Sorry about that. That's the whole hillbilly from Tennessee coming out in me, see? Thank you. All right, how's that? Is that working? Is that working? Is that working? What about now? If I turn it on, it works better, doesn't it? There it goes. Turning it on. It is good to be here with you. I am thankful for the opportunity to be here. A lot of good memories from when we were back here in 2019, and thankful to be a part of this lectureship again. I hate Melody and the boys couldn't be with us this year because they certainly loved getting to be with us back a couple years ago. And a lot of the guys that are on this lectureship, outside of Jesus, I may not have a lot in common with, but one thing I know I have in common with them is that we all want to come back to Linder Road again sometime, because absolutely one of the friendliest and most loving congregations that I've ever been a part of, and just really appreciate you and all that you do, and appreciate being able to be here with you. It was funny, the other day, one of my elders was looking at the poster that I had from this lectureship, and look, he said, man, that's a lot of really good speakers that they've got lined up. And I said, yeah. I said, you know, you've got a lawyer talking about justice and verdicts and evidences. You've got all the apologetics press guys and their expertise in this area. You've got Dan Owen, who's written books on how we got the Bible. You've got John Moore and archaeology and geography. Maybe no one in our brotherhood is more adept at that. You've got guys that have published books for Gospel Advocate. And then he said, well, what are you doing on the lectureship? I said, I don't know. But I will tell you that maybe the benefit is the fact that a country boy, I hate to brag, but I was raised in the country. I live in the country. Last hour, our brother Dave Miller talked about the living in the country versus living in the city. With all the evidence around, I have a great appreciation for the study of apologetics, and it's something that we need to be studying a lot more. I had a guy years ago, I was preaching a series of lessons on apologetics back in Tennessee, and I had a guy come up to me and he said, you know, I just don't really like studying all this kind of stuff. And I said, why not? He said, there's just too much science and history and stuff like that involved, and I don't like the science and history. I'm not crazy about it. I love science and history, so I like studying it. But you know the 3 biggest reasons that I like studying apologetics? Garrett, Gordon, and Gannon. That's my 3 sons. And I asked that guy, I said, well, what do you love? Do you love your son? Because if we love our children, we need to be studying apologetics. And being able to help fortify their faith so that they can make their faith their own. Because you can bet your bottom dollar, if we're not supplying them with the evidence, and as you've already seen in the short time we've been in this lectureship from last night and this morning, there's a ton of it. If we're not supplying them with the evidence of truth, of our basis of what we believe, you can bet your bottom dollar the world's going to give them some evidence, and it will lead them along the wrong path. So we want to talk about this. You're probably looking at the brochure saying, Robinson Crusoe, what does that have to do with anything? Well, I'm trying to put it on a level that we can remember it. And one thing I always tell about people, you don't have to worry about me preaching over your head because I'm not really smart enough to. So we're going to try with that. You know, a couple of weeks ago was Melody and mine's anniversary, our 25th anniversary on September 14th. And some of you that know Melody are amazed that she ever married me, much less that she stuck with me for 25 years. But that was a day that we celebrated. I celebrated. Melody probably mourned a little bit, but I celebrated the day that we got married. 2 weeks before that, on August 31st, was my 47th birthday. And I got to pick what we ate for supper that night. We had an orange cake, not orange in flavor, but orange in decorations. If you see the orange shirt, some of you are thinking, maybe he's a big Boise State fan. And then some of you are thinking, maybe because he lived in Denver, he's a big Broncos fan. And Dan Owens over there going, nope, he's thinking Rocky Top in the back of his head. So we celebrated my birthday. About a month and a half before that was July the 4th. And every July the 4th, this is not fair putting ribs up here right before lunch, is it? But I like to smoke ribs. I like to watch a baseball game. I like to, spend some time with my family and friends. All of those are things that we celebrate because they are beginnings. We celebrate beginnings, don't we? Now, you may not know when my anniversary date was until I told you, but if you knew I had a bride, you knew that there was a beginning to that marriage, right? There was a wedding date. There's an anniversary. You may not have known when I was born, but because I'm up here before you, you knew that at some point I had to have been born, right? Now, maybe you thought because of my gray hair it was way before 1974, but because we have a country, there's a point in time in which the country began. Well, that's what we're going to talk about this morning with the cosmological argument. Now, the first time I heard cosmological argument, I probably thought that it had something to do with lipstick, mascara, and blush. But it has nothing to do with cosmetics. It has to do with the study of the world and the things around us in the universe. And it is one of my favorite arguments. I can't say that until the first time that I really taught a lesson on it. But it's become one of my favorite lessons, and it's become the favorite of a lot of people that study apologetics, but simply because, if for no other reason, it's a great place to start with someone when you're talking about a belief in God, why we believe what we believe, and those types of things. And so to illustrate a little bit, I want to think about Robinson Crusoe. And maybe this will stick in your mind. If nothing else, if you remember Gilligan's theme song, then you'll realize in comparison to other lessons, this lesson will be as primitive as can be. So Robinson Crusoe is walking along the beach one day. He's heading to his fort and he sees a footprint. And immediately he makes two observations about this footprint. Number one, he compares his footprint with that footprint and says, that's not my footprint. I didn't make that footprint. It doesn't match my foot. And so the second thing that he comes up with in his mind is that there must be someone on this island that made that footprint. Now, he has a lot of different observations of who that could be. He thinks that maybe there's some inhabitants of the island that he's yet to meet. Maybe someone came onto the island that he didn't see. He even hypothesizes that maybe that the devil put that footprint there in the sand just to play with his mind a little bit. But he was certain that he didn't make that footprint and that someone had to have made that footprint. Now, why was he so certain someone had to make that footprint? Because there's a footprint there. And footprints don't just appear, right? In essence, that's the cosmological argument. Warren Wilcox used to love to, when he was teaching at Bear Valley, used to love to take people up into the Rocky Mountains, and you get up in those 14ers up 14,000 feet above sea level, and you're looking out across towards the east. It looks like you can almost see the other side of Kansas. You're up so high. And he would sneak up behind you and put his arm around you and say, we can't do that. And we can't. We can't make the beautiful scenery that we see around us. We can't cause any of this stuff to be in existence that occurs naturally. But yet it points to the fact that there must be someone or something that created everything. That's the cosmological argument in a nutshell. So this is an argument that goes back all the way centuries and centuries before us. In fact, there's parts of this argument that were debated by Greek philosophers centuries and centuries ago, the time of Jesus and even before the time of Jesus. It's one that has lasted through the years from the time of Aristotle through Thomas Aquinas, about 1,000 years ago or so. Several Muslim philosophers spent a lot of time with this particular argument, the cosmological argument, maybe you're familiar with. It has their spin on it. Today, maybe the most well-known proponent of this argument is a guy by the name of William Lane Craig. He is a doctor of philosophy and religion, and he debates atheists very often, and this is the argument that he uses and pushes the most. If I had guys that were very studied, and we've got a lot of those guys with us, I think they would say it's probably one of theirs. I got tickled. I was telling earlier that we have lots of doctors and we have lots of well-studied men, and I'm thankful for that and I appreciate their work. But the only letters that have been associated with my name usually is LOL. So, but again, you can study to the deepest level and find this, and you can be simple-minded and look around, and see that the evidence is there. And we'll talk about that for the next few minutes. So what I want us to do is really focus our attention on Thomas Aquinas and the way that he presented the cosmological argument. There's 5 tenets to really the way he presented this. One of those we're not going to talk about because we just heard a great lesson on the teleological argument. It's actually become its own argument, born out of the cosmological argument, basically saying that because there is design, there must have been a designer. Right? So we had a great lesson by Dave Miller about that earlier, and you can go back and listen to that if you weren't here. But we want to notice the first 4 ways that he presents this to us. We're going to examine his arguments, and then we're going to put it under a microscope and give it a little bit of time from the other side of the coin and see if the argument really stands up, and then we'll talk about where it should lead us as we go forward. So the first of these arguments that we want to talk about is the argument from motion. And basically this is the idea that we live in a world that is full of motion. We live in a world that is at motion. We live in a cosmos, in a universe that is full of motion. And everything that has motion has something that caused that motion. That's inertia. A body at rest will stay at rest unless acted upon by some outside force. A body at motion will stay at motion unless acted upon by some outside force. So if we're living in a world full of motion, a world that is in motion, in a cosmos that is in motion, there must have been something that caused all that motion. And we're familiar with that kind. He stole this one basically from Aristotle, by the way, but it's something that we're all familiar with because we've all lined up the dominoes one by one, and then, about the time you get it fixed, your mean little brother would come up and touch one. Well, what happens? This domino falls over because this domino hit it. And this domino falls over because this domino hits it. And you go all the way back to the end of the dominoes, and eventually you find that finger of your little brother that started everything in motion. Now the only other alternative, Gary mentioned last night in his lesson, is an infinite regress. And an infinite regress is the way in the philosophical world they'll talk about this. Infinite means without end. Regress means going backwards. So we're going to go backwards forever and never find a beginning point or a starting point. If you have an infinite regress, then that would explain why there's no need for that force to have started everything. The problem with an infinite regress is that philosophically it's been proven to be illogical. And scientifically, we have no evidence or example of there ever being anything that doesn't have a beginning, that didn't set everything into motion outside of the area of mathematics. And so, if you're going to look and go backwards and backwards and backwards, you have to at that one point at which at least everything gets kicked off or everything gets started. Now from then on, those things can cause other things, but you had to have a beginning, an uncaused cause, an unmoved mover at the beginning that started everything on its progression. So what we do is we can't just prove the existence of God like we can 2 + 2 is 4. Okay? Now, don't disfellowship me or run out of the building, okay? I'm not saying that I don't believe that there's a God. I'm saying that because God is a spirit and outside the physical world, we can't touch Him or taste Him or say, here He is. So what we end up doing is we put the different arguments on both sides of the scale and we say which sounds most logical, which is most scientific, which is most reasonable, that there was an unmoved mover that started all of this, or that we came from an infinite regression with something that is proven to be philosophically and scientifically impossible. Well, the scales seem to tempt towards there being an unmoved mover, right? So this is the way this argument works. Objects are in motion. Everything in motion was put into motion by something else. There cannot be an infinite regress of movers. So if all of the top arguments are correct, then the bottom supposition must be correct. So there must be a first mover itself or himself unmoved. The second way that Thomas Aquinas would argue the cosmological argument is the argument from causation. Now this has nothing to do with movement, just the fact that because there's an effect, there must have been a cause. In fact, sometimes you'll hear the cosmological argument called the argument of causality or something of that effect. In elementary school, you probably had some lessons where you had some cause and effect type of assignments where you had to recognize what was the cause and what was the effect. And they're everywhere. And so the way this argument works is there are some things that are caused. They've come into existence. Anything that is caused had to be caused by something else because nothing caused itself. And we would all agree with that, right? None of us said, I want to be born. And we were born. That's not the way it works, is it? We were caused to be born. As Gary put it last night, I'm here because my parents caused me to be born, and they were there because my grandparents caused them to be born. So we don't come into existence on our own. We're not caused on our own. We have to be caused. So there can't be an infinite regression of causes. So there must have been a first causer itself uncaused. Does that make sense? All right, so you think about this. All of you are in here. How did you get in here into this lecture today? Well, you looked at the schedule and you said at 11:15, Corey Sawyers is speaking about Robinson Crusoe, and I don't know anything about Corey Sawyers or Robinson Crusoe, so I'm going to go in there and listen to it. And that was caused by you looking at the schedule and saying, is there no other lecture that I can go to right now? And that was caused by you being in the fellowship room and it's time, you heard the buzzer sound, it's time to go to a lecture. And that was caused by you being in here for 45 minutes and ready for something to drink and maybe a little snack. So you went in, and you can go all the way back to a long way of all the series of events that led to you being here right now in this moment. But eventually, there's going to be a cause that is uncaused that started the entire chain of events. Number 3 way that Thomas Aquinas would talk about this is the argument from contingency. The argument from contingency. So let me give you some philosophical terms that are pretty easy to break down because they're not really long words. Basically in philosophy there's 2 types of beings. There are necessary beings and there are contingent beings. Necessary beings are those beings that have always exist, do exist, will always exist, and there's no way that they could have never not existed. And some of you that are English professors or English teachers are turning inside out because I think I used about a quadruple negative on that one. But I'm trying to emphasize the point that these necessary beings, or necessary being, whichever it might be, without that necessary being, there would be nothing. Okay? So we need that necessary being. On the other hand, a contingent being is a being that could not have existed and everything go on. Now, things might have been different, but things would go on. Now, everyone in this room right now is sitting there thinking what? Well, I'm not a contingent being. I know I'm pretty necessary, right? I'm a necessary, well, I hate to break it to you, but no matter how many selfies we put on Facebook, we're still not necessary. By the way, that's a lesson a lot in our world need to learn, isn't it? That we're not necessary. We are contingent beings. If you have ever watched the greatest movie that was ever made, It's a Wonderful Life, you know that whenever George Bailey got his wish and he was never born, guess what happened to the world? Kept on turning. Now, everyone's life was changed, right? And that's the point of that movie, is that you affect a lot of different people with your life. However, life went on. Are you with me? There was still a earth. It still kept turning. There was still a Ma Bailey. She had a vastly different life. There was still an Uncle Billy. He had a vastly different life. There was still his little brother whose life was cut short because he wasn't there to save him, but he still had a life. You see, George Bailey found out that he made an impact on others, but he wasn't a necessary being. And none of us are necessary beings. We're not required for the earth to continue or to go on. So this is the way this argument looks. There are contingent beings. Contingent beings can cause other contingent beings, but they can only cause contingent beings, and they are still only contingent beings. An infinite regression is impossible, so there must be at least one, there could be more, but there must be at least one necessary being that started everything. Okay? Number 4, an argument from degrees. And basically this argument is that there has to be a measuring stick somewhere, somehow. Okay? So, like, what is hot and what is cold? What is hot and what is cold? I don't know. If you go to the Sawyer's households on a typical evening, we'll have our air conditioner set at 72 degrees, and the Sawyer's boys and the Sawyer's dad will be sitting there in shorts and flip-flops and a t-shirt, fanning ourselves, saying, boy, it's hot in here. Meanwhile, the lady of the house will have on sweatpants, 2 pair of socks, a sweatshirt, and 3 blankets wrapped around her, saying, ooh, I'm freezing to death. What's hot and what's cold? Well, it depends on your measuring stick, right? We've got to have those measuring sticks to determine what is hot and what is cold. What is big and what is small. What is hard and what is easy. We've got to have something to base everything on to begin with. So if I told you that my 11-year-old son, Gannon, and I went on a walk in the park and we saw an animal this big. Now, is that a big animal or a small animal? It depends on what animal you had pictured in your mind, doesn't it? If I told you that we saw a dog this big, you'd say that was a small dog, right? If I told you we saw a rat this big, you'd say that's a big rat, right? So you have to have something to measure on. So you've probably seen scales like this that show different species or different types of animals or different types of things. One of my favorite apologetic lessons to preach on or teach on is the flood of Noah. And it's in part because we kind of vacation Bible schoolize it to a little degree and make it cute. You know, you see the little tugboat ark with the giraffe whose neck's out the window. It looks like he's about to fall out because it's so small, you know. That's not the ark. And one of the things that I love to put on is it looks very much like this picture, but it's got the ark at the top, and it's got like the Titanic and an ocean liner and a 747 and all these. And when you compare it to those things, the ark is massive. And you're saying, wow, that's big. Well, how do you know that? You compare it to other things. So this argument is to say that we've got to have something that shows us what's big, what's small, what's hot, what's cold. It not only works in tangible things, but it also works in abstract ideas. How do you know that an A+ is good? Some of the young children that are in here saying, I don't know, I've never had one. How do you know that an A+ is good? Well, you see the whole scale and you know that that's at the top of the scale. And that's how you know. So there has to be some measuring stick to tell us. So properties come in degrees. In order for there to be degrees of perfection, there must have been something perfect against which everything else is measured. So there must be a pinnacle of perfection. There must have been something that we can look back at and say, that is the definition of perfection, of good, of right, those types of things. Now, that's basically the way that Thomas Aquinas would use this argument of trying to show that there had to have been something in the past. And if we look at it under the microscope and give it some critical evaluation, which we need to do with every argument, it's easy for us even to build straw man arguments and look at our side, and we get into places like this and we pat each other on the back and say, good job, and never look at what the world... I've listened to way too many podcasts by atheists in the last year and a half since I received this assignment to hear how they look at it. And basically, there's 5 ways that from what I've put together, 5 ways that they try to argue against the cosmological argument. The first 3 we're not going to spend a lot of time on because of what we would recognize that is a flaw in their way of thinking, and that is that the cosmological argument is one that on its own merits has some deficiencies because it doesn't get us all the way to where we want to be. Are you with me? See, sometimes we have this, I saw a debate by a guy, not in the Brotherhood, but a guy who's well known for his work in apologetics. He debated a television atheist who's well known, and I wanted to cheer for the guy that was trying to defend there is a God. But he honestly did a terrible job in the debate because he kept saying, here's what it says in the Bible. Now, don't get me wrong, I love studying the Bible. But when you study the Bible with an atheist, you know what he's going to say? Doesn't mean nothing to me, you know. And that's what it is. So we first got to show that there's a possibility of a God. Then we've got to use other arguments, and we can, the teleological argument, the ontological argument, the moral argument, and show who God is. Then we can go on to prove that the Bible is His Word, which Dan's going to start doing after lunch. Then we can go on to prove that Jesus is His Son. So we start with the cosmological argument, but it's not all that we're using. So the first thing that those who would object to the cosmological argument would say is it doesn't establish any particular God's existence. And that's true. The cosmological argument tells us that there's something out there, but it doesn't exactly tell us what that something is. That would be a problem if we were only using the cosmological argument, but we're not. So we move on. The second objection they would have is that your cosmological argument could prove rather that there's a God, that there's this committee of gods. That's what one guy on a podcast I listened to actually said, a committee of gods or goddesses, and our polytheism. You know, we're monotheistic in that we believe there is one God, but the cosmological argument could prove that there's a multitude of gods. And that's true if we were only using just the cosmological argument, but we're not just using that. Number 3 is that the cosmological argument does not prove the nature of God being a feeling, live, loving, caring, compassionate God. And that's true. Again, that would be a problem if we were only using the cosmological argument. But when you get to the other arguments that talk about how that there is design, you see something about God, don't you? When you see the moral argument and you see that there's something that God put in us and those type of things. So these first 3 are a little bit, we're not going to deal with as much because we have other arguments that we're going to build on beyond the cosmological argument. The fourth one is that you'll actually have some atheists that say, well, no, wait a minute. There could be an infinite regress. Because we can't go back in the DeLorean all the way back into history and see what happened way back in the back. You can't prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that there is not a possibility for an infinite regression. And that's true that I can't. However, any scientist who is open-minded and honest with the facts, any philosopher who is open-minded with the facts, whether they are believers or atheists, will concede an infinite regression is impossible. So let me give you from their words. This is not guys who believe in the Bible, but from their words, how much science, and you're going to hear these kind of concepts over and over, that we would have to ignore to believe there's an infinite regression. When you think about spontaneous generation and how illogical that is and how unlikely that is and some of those things that Dave talked about earlier, how could that just have happened? You know, that the spontaneous generation of life, something that is inanimate becoming animate just at the snap of a finger. The first law of thermodynamics, the second law of thermodynamics. There's so many basic, fundamental, everyone agrees on laws of science that we have to throw out the window to believe in a infinite regression, which is ironic to me because guess what the atheists will accuse us of doing all the time? Why are you ignoring the science? If you would just follow the science. So let's follow the science and see what these guys say about it. Dr. George Wald is a Nobel Prize winner in Harvard University. By the way, sometimes we look at this and we say, man, these guys are idiots. No, they're not idiots. They're really smart men. And they've really studied a lot. And they probably studied it more than most of us in here have studied and know a lot more about science than most of us in here know. So listen to what this guy says. He says that one only has to contemplate the magnitude of this task, and the task he's talking about is that life just suddenly appeared, to concede that the spontaneous generation of a living organism is impossible. Now, he keeps using that word, but he knows what it means. That's a Princess Diaries line for you if you didn't catch that. Yet here we are as a result, I believe, of spontaneous generation. Here's what he just said. It's impossible for life to just pop up out of nowhere, and yet I believe life just popped up out of nowhere. I wish we would quit ignoring the science, don't you? If you think about it, I'm not trying to in any way encourage the lottery. I don't even know if there is a lottery in Idaho, but we have my son one time was with Keith Sargent, and Keith came by and said, I'm fixing to go play pool with your son, Gannon. He was about 7 or 8 at that time, and he said, Gannon bet me $5 he could beat me in pool. So I went to Gannon and I said, what's this I hear about you gambling? And Gannon said, I'm not gambling. I said, well, Mr. Keith said you bet him $5 that you could beat him in pool. He said, I wasn't gambling, I was just betting. I said, well, we'll have to have that talk later, but I'm not encouraging betting or gambling, okay? But they tell us that the odds of you picking a Powerball winning numbers to win the lottery is about 1 in 10 to the 7th power. I saw your numbers going up last night, Gary, and I thought he's fixing to steal my stuff. But lots of to the power talk, but we're talking about different things here. For you to do that twice, they say would be 1 in about 10 to the 14th power. Statistically, that's probably not going to happen, but there is a chance. You know, you're still in that ballpark of a chance. The guy on the screen here, Charles Eugene Guy, is a Swiss mathematician, and as Andy Griffith would say, he's a good mathematician. And he tells us that the idea of life just popping into existence, of spontaneous generation, he says that the odds of that happening is about 1 in 10 to the 160th power. So to give you an idea of how big a number that is, there it is. That's a 1 with 160 zeros behind it. Now, some of you are right now counting the zeros. Just trust me, there's 160 zeros. And listen to this part. I don't even know what to call that number, but on the other hand, I do. Because statisticians will tell us that anything over 1 to the 50th power, 1 in 10 to the 50th power, is, and this is their word, absurd. So the idea that life just popped into existence out of nowhere is 3 times absurd. Now you think about that for just a minute. And that's an interesting word because it's the same word that Charles Darwin used when he said, to suppose that the eye could have been formed by natural selection seems, I freely confess, absurd in the highest degree. What's the highest degree? 1 in 10 to the 160th power. It's absurd. If Charles Darwin is the king of evolution, then George Gaylord is the crown prince of evolution. He said the sudden appearance of life is not only the most puzzling feature of the whole fossil record, which Jeff Miller is going to talk about today or tomorrow, I forget which, the most puzzling feature of the whole fossil record, but it's also its greatest apparent inadequacy because there's no sign of it in the fossil record. It's not there. Sir Frederick Hoyle said the current scenario of the origin of life is about as likely as a tornado passing through a junkyard beside Boeing Airplane Company accidentally producing a 747 airplane. He's an agnostic and an astronomer. Now, I don't know. I guess if you had enough time, and as Gary mentioned last night, that's the hero of evolution, is time. That's why they keep backing up the date on when it all got started, because we need more time, more time, more time. If you had enough time and you had enough tornadoes, could you possibly get a 747 out of the junkyard? I'm not going to say you couldn't. But you still haven't told me where did the tornado come from, where did the junkyard come from, and where did the Boeing plant come from. So we're still back with our cosmological argument problems. In fact, Richard Dawkins in his book, The Watchmaker, talks about how that if you give enough monkeys, enough typewriters, and enough time, they could produce one of Shakespeare's masterpieces. Maybe so. I've never seen a monkey type. I don't know how that would work. But you still haven't told me where the monkeys, the typewriters, or Shakespeare came from. That's the problem that we end up being at. Sir Francis Crick said the origin of life appears to be almost a miracle. I'd say you're not far from the kingdom there on that. Almost a miracle, so much of the conditions which would have had to been satisfied to keep it going. Jonathan M.S. Pierce says, in other words, there's only one cause, the universe or the Big Bang or similar. You know what he's saying? He's saying, I believe in the cosmological argument, though he didn't want to say it that way. He's saying there had to have been something that started it all because it couldn't have started itself. It had to have had something. And here's the fifth objection, is that sometimes you'll have atheists say that this argument is self-defeating. In other words, they say, you're right, everything has to have a cause, every movement has to have a mover, but your God, you say, is uncaused and unmoved. So what's His cause? What's His movement? How did He get going? Well, the problem is that we're trying to apply the laws of our earth, our science, our physical realm to a God who is a spirit. It's the wrong questions to even ask. So let me give you this one. You see on the screen there, I've always wanted to stand in front of a green screen. I feel like I'm a weatherman now. What color is on the screen? It's green. Here's the second question. What does green taste like? Like spinach. Spinach tastes like spinach, but green doesn't taste like spinach, does it? Green doesn't have a taste. Now you can talk about what spinach or English peas or that green machine little protein drink tastes like or whatever, but the color green is light reflected back to us. That screen is absorbing Roy G. Biv, you remember that from junior high? The Roy and the G Biv, but the Roy and the Biv, but the G is up here on the screen. It's reflected back to you because of that. See, when you try to apply the laws of science, of this cosmos, of this world, of philosophy to a spirit, then it doesn't fit. That's why there has to have been something outside of this realm, outside of the laws of nature, outside of philosophical arguments that caused everything. So there's a number of theories of what that cause could have been that started everything. There's the nebular And some of these are kind of old, and some of them are less accepted than others. But this is the idea that you had this spinning ball of matter that started spinning faster and faster and tighter until it started just throwing matter out everywhere, and that's what created the cosmos. You know what the problem with that is? Where'd the matter come from? What caused it to spin? You've got the idea of planetesimal. You've got these two stars that were like ships passing in the night. They were going along, and they got so close to each other that their gravitational pull started pulling chunks off of each other and throwing it out into space, and that's where the cosmos came from. The problem we have is, where did the stars come from? What caused them to move toward each other? What caused the gravitational pull that threw everything everywhere? The continuous generation is like a continuous generation is kind of like the idea of there's this epicenter that's pulsating matter out. Okay, so it's creating matter and it's projecting it out, and it's kind of like if you throw a rock in the middle of a pond and how those waves move outward, you know, that's what's constantly happening. The problem with this is that if that were what happened, then you would expect the really young material to be near that epicenter and the really old material to be further out. And what we find in reality is new and old material all mixed up together. And we still hadn't talked about where the material came from and what's making it pulsate outward. There's the idea that everything is in this. There's this epicenter of energy that's causing everything to come in. Again, you've got the problem of where did it come from? We would have run out of energy by now, and probably we would have all been sucked into a black hole. Even the Big Bang, which is the most familiar probably to most, where did the matter come from? What caused it to bang? You're still left with the idea that there has to be something that started everything. So that leaves us with a sixth theory of where everything could have come from. In the beginning, God. Because He's outside of those properties of science and philosophy. Which leads us to the Word of God. If there is a God, then shouldn't He have wanted to communicate with us? And He does in His Word. And in fact, in Romans chapter 1, verses 19 through 21, notice how many times he talks about it's evident. It's evident. One of the things that he talks about is evident is His eternal power. With every theory of where it all started, there's a massive amount of power involved. And God, with His power, proved who He was so that we could understand, so that we are without excuse if we don't believe. And so you notice how it says He's revealed, it's known, they knew. How did they know? It's almost like Paul's using the cosmological argument to say, because you look around and see stuff, you know there has to be an epicenter of power, of ability, something that's outside of everything that we see. And that's the cause of everything. And you can't spend time, if you're a hunter or if you're a fisherman or if you raise a garden or if you farm, you can't spend time in nature and not realize. You don't have to have a microscope. You don't have to have a PhD. You can just look and see. Not only was there design, by the way, Dave, in the way those maple seeds come down the helicopter, there's designs in little boys that like to throw them up in the air and scatter them even further. You can't be around it and say there's not something cool going on here. That's beyond what we know. And over this argument is used. In Acts chapter 14 in Lystra, the argument is made that you ought to have known about God because of what you see in creation. In Acts chapter 17, he's talking to those people in Athens, and he says, with all your philosophers and all your science and all your research, and even quotes their philosophers, he calls them ignorant 3 times. Because you're ignoring the evidence that is all around you. In Psalm 19, he basically says there's 2 reasons I want to praise God. Verses 1 through 6, I want to praise God for His creation. And verses 7 through the end of the Psalm, I want to praise God for His Word. And in those first 6 verses, he's saying, isn't it awesome this part of creation? Isn't it awesome this part of creation? And after he talks about all of creation and how awesome it is, he says we ought to praise the one that made all this happen. Once we go through the other arguments, and we learn who that God is, then because of the cosmological argument's beginning, if shown us that there had to be a beginning, it helps us to realize that there is a God. And not only can we know that there is a God, now get this part, not only can we know that there is a God, we can know that God. Now that's what's really overwhelming. It's pretty overwhelming to see all the evidence and to see the wisdom that He has and the power that He has and the knowledge that He has and how He thought out every little detail before it could ever even happen. It's even more amazing to think that He knows Corey Sawyers and He wants to have a relationship with me. So it's not just an academic exercise when we go through these arguments and think about who God is and the possibility of there being a God and what He's like and what His Word says and all the evidence that He's provided for us. But it's knowing that He wants to have a relationship with us, that He wants us to be a part of His family, that He wants us to spend an eternity with Him. I don't understand how He spoke everything to existence, but I sure can't understand why He wants me. But I'm thankful that He does. That's why we study apologetics, so that we not only know there is a God, but we know that God. There's a shine on the clock back there. I don't know if I'm 15 minutes early or 15 minutes late, but that's the lesson. So, take the cosmological argument, build on it with the other arguments, let it fortify your faith. We were talking about last night how when you think about all the speakers and all the things we're talking about, it's kind of overwhelming. It's kind of like drinking from a fire hose. But we want you to be overwhelmed because it's not as we sometimes think that scientists have all the evidence and we have just a little bit. It's actually quite the reverse, because behind the cosmological argument, behind that unmoved mover, that pinnacle of perfection, is the creator of not only the heavens and the earth, but the creator of science itself. He's the chief scientist. And so the more we study Him and the more we know Him, we're not only in awe of what He's done, but awe of what He wants to do in our lives. And if we can help you with that, we certainly want to as well. Thank you for your attention.